is the amount of evidence that it's coming to market with enough? Do we have confidence that we're going to actually see in the real world what's seen in phase 2? Because, for a lot of these products, especially in sort of life-threatening illnesses, you're coming to market or being allowed to come to market earlier. That doesn't mean you get access earlier. Hi, I'm Kostas.
Hi, I'm Lester, and welcome to another episode of What's with RWE. So, Kostas, what's with RWE these days?
Well, a lot. Actually, a lot's been happening. I think we're heading into the summer months, so I expect that maybe there's going to be less activity, but we certainly have had a very exciting spring here in Canada. So if I think of some of the big things to touch on, certainly the guidelines published by CADTH in terms of the quality for RWE evidence. How do you produce it? How do you ensure from the get-go that it's the kind of evidence that you can actually make real decisions on, whether it's regulatory or reimbursement? I think that's been a really exciting happening, and that was published during the CADTH Symposia this year, back end of May. So I think that was a good start for Canada to be able to say we're all in on RWEs, and we just want to ensure that the quality is there for their adoption into the decision-making framework. So I think that's one big thing. I think the other big thing has been the sort of, I'm just going to call it the solicitation for comments by CADTH on time-limited reimbursement. It's been called conditional reimbursement in other markets, but the topic is all the same. It's basically, we're going to give you reimbursement. We're going to allow you to be utilized in market in the real world. And then at some later point in time, you need to bring back the data to confirm that what we agreed to, the profile of the product that we agreed to, whether it's efficacy, whether it's safety, that you can confirm that it's actually what's being delivered. I think most people look at that and they say that confirmatory evidence still has to be phase 3 data. And potentially it is what's going to be needed for the majority of products. I think the challenge is going to be, especially in rare diseases where it's even 2 years, 3 years is a challenging period of time to find enough patients. There you might have to look at alternatives. And I think the real world experience for patients may be that alternative. It's not going to be right for every scenario, but especially for more and more rare populations, I think we're going to start to see a mix of evidence start to be used in that kind of determination where you're using it in the real world, you're using it in a broader range of patients. Why would you now want to go back and only look at randomized controlled data from a very narrow population to make your broader reimbursement or access decision? So I think it's opening that up for commentary, opening it up even as a concept here in Canada, I think is really exciting. It's a move that other markets have already done. It's been in use in other markets for many years. So it's exciting, I think, for the Canadian market access landscape to now have another tool.
Great. Actually, slight tangent. I was going through, so actually one of our colleagues, Susan, we all have to read the RWE framework document. It's like 67 pages long. Yeah. And me doing a little bit of, it's a little long for my liking. However, it gave me a great chance to actually try out ChatGPT. So I actually took the document and said, hey, ChatGPT, can you summarize each individual section for me? Yeah. Oh, that's too short. Can you actually give me 5 bullets for each section? Then can you give me the common thread that goes through the entire document? And actually, it's actually pretty good. I was talking to some of my colleagues about it, or some of our colleagues about it, and they said this roughly the same thing, that the framework tends to be around the idea of what you have to do is you have to document what you're proposing to do, and then subsequently do what you actually propose you're going to do. That seems to be the common thread amongst the that framework itself. So another use for ChatGPT.
First off, OpenAI is going to have to start paying us for sponsorship if we keep this up. But I think I think it hit the nail on the head, right? Which is, I think, two things. Number one, pre-planning. So, the knock on real world evidence often is you're just going in and cherry picking what supports your position, your hypothesis, right? So, just like any other experiment, you need to go in with everything defined. What's your hypothesis? What is the statistical approach you're using? What data would you accept? What wouldn't you accept? The entire framework for the decision of how do I address my hypothesis and how do I know if it's true or not, right? So it makes perfect sense. And I think the other piece that's in the framework is the transparency, trying to make as much as possible transparent what the data set is, what is in there, what's not in there, what's the code used to actually run your analysis, all these kinds of things. When you have that level of transparency, the confidence that you're not just cherry picking, that the evidence that you're utilizing can be trusted, I think that's really what the other piece that it gets at. So between actually having a framework in place, having the sort of the protocol, so to speak, in place, and then having transparency so people know you actually did follow that protocol, it makes sense, I think, for most people.
What I'm thinking about is, do you think all this work that CADTH is putting forth to actually talk about RWE, or is putting a framework together for RWE, and of course the time limited recommendations, I'm sure there's going to be more protocols or more topics that are going to be brought up around RWE. Do you think this is a precursor to outcome-based agreements? Because we are a little bit behind from maybe that perspective. So do you think this is just a precursor to something that many other countries have already done?
So I think yes. I think the answer is yes. I think in a way, it's a good thing that we haven't rushed out there, because we now have other examples to pull from to say, how do you do this? I know for a fact they're not starting from scratch, right? They're taking the learnings from other markets. But to your specific question, is this the precursor? I think it's the trend. I think it's where it's going, right? That's the eventuality. If you are looking at time sensitive or time limited reimbursement or contingent reimbursement, it's not just about giving you time to create evidence. It's about actually creating a process that delivers what you're promising, right? And putting skin in the game on both sides of the equation, right? What does government want? They want the best value for their dollar, obviously, for all our tax dollars. But what does that value look like? Well, obviously, I think for most of us, it means better health, right? So what's the best health I can buy for a fixed or constrained budget? That's what they're trying to come away with. It's not feasible for those budgets to continue to grow out of hand as they did back in the 80s, I think is probably the comparison that most people have in mind. So if that's what they're trying to achieve, then having the time to show them the evidence in the real world that what you are telling them you're delivering as a manufacturer of this new intervention, I think is going to be the way that it goes. But you now have to have a framework in place to create those agreements. PCPA in Canada here, which has taken up the role of really negotiating on behalf of all of the provinces. That's been the first step, but it's that those negotiations around price for the most part. It's about budget impact. It's not about the outcome yet, and I think that's the next step.
So that's great. So thanks a lot for that, Kostas. I completely agree with you, but we did jump ahead maybe a couple of steps forward already because of just assuming there's billions of people watching and not everyone is familiar with some of the terms we're using. So let's maybe step back first, and maybe if you could help me define what is an outcome-based agreement, or we're probably going to refer to OBAs. It's a little shorter, right? So could you maybe help us define that?
Sure. So outcomes-based agreements, I think they differ from a traditional agreement in that there is an outcome of interest that is attached to whether or not you have delivered on the agreement or you fulfilled your side of the agreement, right? So that's really fundamentally it. And it could be the definition of that could be a lot of different things. It could be a hard outcome like survival. It could be cure. It could be avoiding hospitalizations. There's a lot of different things that you could premise that on, right? And it's all contextual to what's the intervention, what are you trying to avoid. Oftentimes, the thing you're trying to avoid is actually quite costly to, in this case, the payer, and they're trying to identify an intervention that actually reduces that cost. And that's really the basis of an outcome-based agreement. There has to be an actual outcome. Typical agreements that you would see executed today oftentimes are related to, well, if I treat more than X number of patients in the province, I'll give you a discount, or you get the intervention for free, right? Or it really tends to be around the price or the total cost of the intervention, and it's really just managing budget. It really does not hinge at all on any sort of outcome. It's a purely financial agreement. So that's the real big difference. One based on just pure finance, the other based on a clinical, typically a clinical or other health system outcome.
Got it. It's really helpful. And then you also brought up the term PCPA. So I'm not going to ask you to define it or remember exactly this acronym stands for, but just for those of our audience that aren't familiar with the Canadian system, and to be honest with you, I didn't know this complexity of our system until I actually started getting to healthcare a couple of years back, maybe 5-6 years back. Before then, I actually thought, oh, it's a single payer system. Everything's really easy. You just, it is not that way in Canada. So maybe you can help the audience understand what is the role of PCPA, or what is PCPA, and then what is the role of PCPA as well?
I'll take a step back and say, start with CADTH, right? Because that's step one. If you have already received market authorization in Canada, so Health Canada has said this product is safe and effective and therefore is allowed to be marketed, the next decision that is made is by CADTH. They are a health technology assessment body, so they're assessing the value of that product, and value can be seen in a number of different ways. But what they're essentially doing is putting together the financial and the clinical together in one assessment. That's fundamentally what a health technology assessment does. It brings those two things together and looks at the intersection. They will often do economic models or use a manufacturer's economic model and assess whether it makes sense for the Canadian environment. Sometimes these are transferred from other markets and to be used here. But at the end of the day, what they do gets encapsulated in a recommendation, right? And the recommendation is really a recommendation to the provinces that are their stakeholders, right? This is a health technology assessment on behalf of the provinces, typically. So they will recommend either we recommend adopting this, it's good value, or we recommend adopting this on some sort of criteria that the patient population is limited, or that the price needs to be lower, or some other criteria, or they will recommend flat out that this is not a good value and should not be adopted. Right. So those are sort of the three large buckets that it typically falls into. If it's either of the first two, so a positive recommendation or a recommendation with some sort of criteria attached to it, it goes to the next step, and that's the PCPA. PCPA basically is the party that, on behalf of the provinces, negotiates an agreement, essentially. It covers price, as I said, it could cover price, but it's not just limited to price. It can be limited to affordability, the full budget. What is it going to cost? And it was meant to, this intermediate step was meant to replace the manufacturer having to go province by province by province by province and actually doing this, and then also having disparate agreements province to province. So one province may have, was able to get a good deal, and the other ones look at it and go, why didn't I get that? So this actually brings a lot of negotiating power to the PCPA, to the payer, and also allows hopefully some speeding up of the process so that you're getting access faster. And then the last step is actually once you have that letter of intent, that agreement in principle with the PCPA in hand, the manufacturer would go province to province and just sign the final actual legal agreement that yes, we're going to be putting it on our formulary. So that's the process in Canada, and that's where CADTH versus the sort of the pricing negotiation authority versus the last line the provinces fit in. Of course, as always, we also have INES in Quebec that stands on their own. They can choose to participate in or utilize the evidence from any of these other agencies. They do have the capacity to do it all on their own, and they typically have a broader approach to what is value. They take what we call the societal approach. So they're looking at lost productivity, things like that is not always covered by other health technology assessment groups in Canada or considered by provinces in Canada. So Quebec is kind of a special case. They can pick and choose how they want to interact in this system.
Yeah, incredibly complicated. This is until I started working just not even directly in like therapeutics, but just in diagnostics, it just became clearer to me that there was this type of complexity. So, thanks a lot for kind of educating everyone on the podcast about this. But this is definitely something that's a little bit more unique about Canada than some other countries. But back to the outcome-based agreement. So let's say outcome-based agreements. Let's say this is a precursor, and that we are moving towards that type of trend. And I think some groups would call outcome-based agreements value-based care. Right? I think that's a very, very hot topic. That could be considered. They're not exactly the same, but they sort of fall. Outcome-based agreements probably falls into the bucket of value-based care. I know you've worked in large pharmaceutical company in the past for many, many years. Can you give some examples of ones maybe you've undertaken, or ones that you know of that were successful or actually not successful? That would actually be kind of interesting. What are some of the learnings from those?
Yeah, so I think maybe one of the earliest examples is one that was something that was agreed upon between my former company, Janssen, and this was Janssen in the UK at the time. So I'm not speaking out of turn here. A lot of this is public information. They essentially created one of the first outcomes-based agreements, and it was for a product called Velcade for multiple myeloma. Not a lot of really new products at that point in time. It was considered to be a really expensive product because of the duration of use, for these patients. But I think, we were quite confident that what we had seen in the clinical trials meant that the value was there for the patient. The efficacy was certainly well beyond anything that was available at that point in time. And an agreement was struck essentially with the NHS to reimburse based on what we thought was the outcomes that we would see versus what would happen if we weren't able to deliver that. I think it was successful in a couple of ways. It was certainly successful for Janssen in trying to get access at that point in time for something that, it was the sort of the beginning of the era of really expensive new chemotherapy agents. So there was a lot of pushback, but it was certainly important for patients, certainly a success for patients, because they actually had a product in their arsenal that was incredibly effective. And it actually exceeded, I think, at that time, if I remember correctly, the outcomes that anyone had anticipated based on the phase 3 clinical trials. So I think it's a great early example, one of the earliest examples that I can think of, and certainly one that I'm happy to have been, a part of in terms of being part of Janssen at that point in time. But it's certainly an early example where, you've got early access for patients. It delivered from a clinical perspective, at least as good as it had, as people had expected. So I think that's a win-win, and one of the best examples that I can sort of look at.
No, I think that's perfect, because that's something that I think people don't fully understand about. They say if you knew what OBAs were, and were just us bringing up this topic, why should we have this, right? And part of it seems like it is directly benefiting patients because it provides access quicker, right? It seems,
Yeah.
at least from what you're telling me, it seems like patients are getting access to life-changing therapies potentially much quicker than otherwise they would receive. And part of that, I think, is because I think one thing that you talked about was this innovation part of it. When something is innovative, but innovative is just in some ways means different, right? It's not what you see normally or part of current standard of care, then there is resistance to potentially using it. So this is OBA's almost I think of it almost a way to almost like lubricate that gear so that things could start churning and people can start testing things out, right? Would that be an accurate way of kind of thinking about it, for at least from a patient perspective, why it benefits patients in general?
Absolutely. And, it is one of the things that, being a patient here in Canada, especially if you have, an illness where there's a lot of research happening, a lot of new products being developed in oncology, our space I think, one of the prime examples. The science is moving so fast. The products come to the market globally are coming so quickly. It oftentimes oversteps the decision for how do we afford this? How do we pay for this for everyone who needs it? Is the amount of evidence that it's coming to market with enough? Do we have confidence that we're going to actually see in the real world what's seen in phase 2? Because for a lot of these products, especially in sort of life-threatening illnesses, you're coming to market or being allowed to come to market earlier. That doesn't mean you get access earlier, right? Because the hurdle tends to be much higher for reimbursement than it is, sadly to say, for regulatory authorization. But the concern oftentimes, and the reason why OBAs, people are slow to adopt them, is because they don't want to risk the patient. So if you're coming to market early with thinner data packages, you don't want to expose patients to risk. So that's one of the pushbacks to why don't we do this for every product? I mean, just after phase 2, get them on the market and let's have a look and see what happens in the real world. You don't want to waste money for products that don't work, right? So where you could have already paid for and given a patient an opportunity with a product that actually has been proven to have a particular outcome. And you certainly don't want to have to bring a product to market that generates hope for patients, and then as the political folks then having to look at it at the end and say it's really not living up to what we had expected, and then having to pull that back. Right. So that's actually been one of the more challenging aspects, the political aspect of having to then pull back coverage or access for products that just aren't living up to the expectation. And I think that really comes down to having a clear, a transparent, and a fair process for making the assessments, keep making it public so that people understand why this doesn't make sense to continue to have access to it. But that, just for fair balance, those are the concerns often with OBAs.
Got it. That's completely fair enough. Now, and I understand this from a patient perspective. I can understand why someone will want to be vehemently behind OBAs, because it can provide them potentially a chance, just however whatever that chance may be, to improve their chances of overall survival or improve their quality of life. Completely understand that perspective. From a payer perspective, it makes sense as well, because you're paying for performance. So if the thing doesn't perform, then you don't pay for it, or you pay less for it, or whatever the agreement is. So there's a potential for cost savings, or even if there's no cost savings, you're paying for something of so-called value, right? Now, I'm trying to think of it from just playing devil's advocate a little bit, thinking it from the manufacturer's perspective. Why would I provide a product and not potentially get paid for it because people are consuming it and I'm getting paid later on for it, or potentially won't get paid for something? The way I guess I'm thinking about it is, the pushback I could see would be, when you go to a restaurant, you order food, you eat the food, you don't like the food, you still pay for the food. there's no like, okay, sorry, like I don't like the food, so I'm gonna go and not pay for it, right?
Yeah.
So from a manufacturer's perspective, like how did you think about it? Was there that internal debate as well at an organization about potentially providing something, just the concept of providing a product and then not getting paid for it seems just a little bit counterintuitive for any for-profit organizations. How did you have to wrestle through that actually as an organization in the past?
Yeah, and I will say up front that how the agreement is actually struck. So whether you get paid during the observation period or not, or if that's something that happens at the end, or you get paid and you give back if it doesn't sort of, those mechanics I think are negotiable. They're something that can be worked on. But I think the fundamental question here, if I'm hearing you right, is why does a manufacturer want to get involved in this? I mean, isn't it just better off to just get it on the market and that's it? And I think that actually is the critical issue. So if you have a product that you think brings value to the patient and to the healthcare system, right? Which I think most manufacturers, when they're bringing products to market after having spent billions, will actually say, yeah, we brought it to the market because we believe in the value of this product. They are willing to jump through a lot of hoops to get that product to into the hands of clinicians to be able to prescribe it to the appropriate patients, right? And I think this is really a different mechanism for them to ensure that at the end of the day, patients can have access to what they believe is an innovation that improves care compared to it not being on the market, or being not just being on the market, being reimbursed. That's fundamentally really the last hurdle and the most important hurdle here in Canada. So I think they have incentive. I will say as a footnote here, if you have been in pharma for a long time, for some of those of us in the audience who maybe have had a longer history, you probably have lived through that transition of the era of Me Too's, right? Where this is a giant brand in a giant market. So 4, 5, 6 different companies just make slight variations, and you're really bringing sufficient and significant innovation to the market. What you're doing is you're just trying to capitalize on the growth of this new indication, let's say. So we've all lived through that. I think we've come out the other side knowing that's not good enough. And you can take a look at how many companies are killing products now in phase 3, right? So, in the past, in the olden days, as I was about to say, in the past, companies would be really, really, gun shy about killing something in phase 3. If it made it that far, they're probably going to push it through one way or another, whether it's through marketing, whether it's through sub-segmentation of their population, whatever that looks like, they would probably get it to market. But these days, that doesn't really happen. So the kinds of products that are making it typically to market have a level of innovation that may be different than 20 years ago. And so, if I look at, is there an incentive for them to get it to the market? Are they really willing to do what's necessary to get this into the hands of clinicians and to treat patients? I think my answer would be for sure. They believe in what they're bringing to market actually is beneficial.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because I think there's this, obviously, given the current circumstances in the world, COVID and everything that has happened, there has been, I think, a little bit of a negative light that's shined on, I would say, the pharmaceutical industry, actually a lot of healthcare, actually the industry in general has taken a little bit of a hit there. And I would say most people that at least I've ever interacted, or everyone that I've ever interacted that works for a pharmaceutical company, a biotechnology company, they got into that specific role because they want to help patients. Because quite frankly, if you wanted to make tons of money, you could probably have gone to Wall Street. You could have made some sort of app or something like that. I don't know, right? It's not like the biggest company is like a search company, right? Or one that like links people together through friendships or whatever that may be. So by and large, most people that at least I've ever met from pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, healthcare companies, it really is about the patients. They want to do good ultimately.
Yeah. And, people look at pharma folks and say, well, they're in it for the money. That's been earned in the past to a certain extent, right? But as I said, I think we've come past through that period of time, and the way that companies are operating, the types of products and the focus that they're putting on innovation and really bringing value. As you say, value-based care is not just a buzzword. It is a necessity nowadays to be able to access markets. So that focus, I think, has been really positive. The other thing that I didn't mention is that, pharma already does this. So, if you maybe not through an agreement, but, you talk about bringing a product to market, offering it, and not even getting paid. There's something called patient support programs. right? And here in Canada, they are quite ubiquitous for most products, and they tend to sort of bridge the gap between market authorization, so when you're allowed to sell the product into the market, and to the point at which that there's reimbursement. And so a lot of pharma companies are paying for patients to have access at a reduced cost or no cost in some cases to these products. And I think that's something that they're already doing, and it's not in a formalized fashion, right? I mean, there's no agreement at the end that says, well, we're going to track these patients, we're going to look at outcomes, and if we see something specific, then automatically we get reimbursement. So they're doing this already, they're making the investments, but there's no real payoff at the end of a lot of these programs. It's just a matter of making sure patients have access during that intervening period.
Got it. Got it. And yeah, that's a really interesting program. So this patient support program, or what we usually call PSPs, just for short.
Yeah.
It was good that actually you went through the entire process of, I guess it's not even the entire process. You went through part of the process of how a drug will actually gets in the hands of patients. So there's Health Canada has to give approval. Then there's also CADTH, and then there's actually there's also a PCPA. Sorry, I messed up the acronyms a little bit there, mixed them up. And that process itself could just take time. Right? I don't know. Actually, be interesting to see what is the time frame from one all the way down to the end. I'm sure someone has done that already. But that time, there's a huge gap, and that gap needs to be filled somehow. Or I guess one could choose not to fill it, and pharmaceutical companies have decided to fill it by providing these PSP programs, which are patient support programs that provide access to the innovative therapy. With once Health Canada, of course, gives it the safety check and say, "Hey, this is safe," but they don't get basically don't get paid for it. That's in a nutshell what that is, right? So I'm wondering, from a let's say outcome-based agreements. I don't know what the timeline is, what the horizon is. Maybe it's 1 year, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 5 years down the line. I don't know when these get enacted, but the trend is moving towards that end. What do you think about PSP programs? Because there's actually a lot of PSP programs are not something you just put together. There's a large infrastructure that needs to be put in place in order to support patient support programs. So do you think OBAs is essentially will kill off PSPs, or do you think PSPs will take a different shape once, say, OBAs become the standard?
So I'm going to say something controversial here, maybe not for the first time, but yeah, I think the days of PSPs are numbered. I think that they will be replaced by OBAs. I don't see a real rationale for the coexistence of the two. There may be potential for maybe some classes to be adopted first as OBAs. So, like I said, higher cost products, whether it's in rare disease, whether it's in cancer, I think those are going to be the first to go. There might be a role in some other indications, but I think eventually you're going to probably see a full transition to OBAs, and PSPs will be sort of an interim point in history. And it just, you just have to take a look at what our capabilities are that are going to enable that versus what we, have to do today as a stopgap. And I think that's the big issue. PSPs are a stopgap that are used today because we just don't have the appropriate tools in place.
Got it. Actually, thinking about this, can PSPs be a gateway into an OBA? So instead of thinking, okay, they completely be replaced right off the bat right now, as we all know, there has to be some sort of transition. Could PSPs act as almost like a transitional point for OBAs? And I guess the way that I'm thinking about it, I'm just spitballing here and brainstorming here a little bit. PSPs right now, you provide access to this innovative therapy. The manufacturer isn't being reimbursed for it, but patients are getting access. Could, for instance, the manufacturer keep track of, let's say, the outcomes, the administrative overhead, or let's say partner with healthcare systems to also look at the administrative overhead, and then use that as potentially part of their submission package, right? So this is therapy itself acting in the real world, and here are the overall costs in the real world, but still through a PSP program. and then subsequently that be a part of the submission package, and then of course maybe then transition over to OBA. What do you think about that type of concept, Kostas?
So I think there's the potential for it, right? I think there are a few things that need to be addressed. First and foremost is the privacy rules around PSP, right? So number one, they're not meant to replace clinical trials, whether that's an observational trial or anything like that. So anything that has a hypothesis, there still is consent, but it's very limited in terms of what can be collected and followed up on in a PSP program. Some of these guidances are set internally by the companies. Some of them are set by provinces and the REBs within Canada. But at the end of the day, somehow we need to have the approval and the ability legally to not only provide that product to a patient in a PSP program, but then to also track the outcome side, something more than what is traditionally tracked. Okay, so that's the first thing that needs to be addressed is that those legal and privacy ramifications. The second thing that needs to be addressed is the data collection and the access to the data. Right now, the cost of actually pulling most of the data that would be required to conduct this kind of an assessment for an OBA, but utilizing that PSP framework is pretty expensive. Right? You're doing an entire, in some cases, chart review. Maybe you're just calling up. Oftentimes, it's calling up and getting information, or a clinician filling out a form. That's very simple. But if you're looking at the amount of data that would be required for a more complex clinical outcome assessment, that's really beyond, I think, the scope that any individual pharma is willing to commit to get that product assessed and then reimbursed. So I think there's two things there. There's the legal piece and there's the practical piece of how do you actually collect that data in order to be able to do the analysis. And I think if we take a look at the third piece, which is the quality of the data, if you're to take a look at PSPs today, I don't think that they would meet the criteria that has been proposed by CADTH, for example, in terms of the quality of what's being collected, having a predefined sort of protocol sort of in place and a way to analyze it and so on and so forth. And I'm just going to say right now, that's not a blanket statement for everything, but it is probably on average accurate. It's not what the PSPs were meant for, right? So that's something to keep in mind. They are doing their job. They're providing the product to the patients with a minimal sort of understanding of how it's being used until that patient can access it otherwise, right? So just to be fair, PSPs were never designed for this. Could they be tweaked? If you could deal with each of these sort of three categories: the quality of the data, how do you collect the data, and the legal issues around collecting the data, could you tweak it to make it more along the lines of what could become eventually an OBA, or an agreement could be based upon it? Yeah, absolutely. You could. If you could address those, you absolutely could.
That's really great. These are great topics for maybe like our next podcast. Actually, I wrote them down. Legal, it's not maybe the most exciting thing, but I think that's actually a very interesting component. Data collection, of course, and then of course quality of data. And actually, it would be interesting to get someone on the podcast that actually manages a PSP program or somehow oversees a PSP program and actually have that type of conversation. It actually be quite interesting actually on that front. But I know we're running up against time. Our producers did tell us that we should have kept this one short, and unfortunately, it looks like we actually went over again. But just to wrap things up, it is Canada Day coming up very, very soon. So I don't know, Kostas, what are you up to for Canada Day? Are you going anywhere for Canada Day?
I think we're supposed to finally get some dry weather here. So for me, it's going to be hopping on the bike with my kids and going for a nice long ride, enjoying our weather for the day. But maybe a barbecue, and at some point might be in the future as well. How about you?
I'm looking forward to the barbecues as well. That's just one of my favorite things, of course, is barbecue. So, okay, nice. Great. Thank you very much, everyone that's been listening in to this podcast. So thank you very much again. And please, if you do like this podcast, like, subscribe. Also, if you have any questions or you want to provide any back feedback, please put your comments in the comment section of this video. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Happy Canada Day, everybody. Hi, I'm Kostas.
Hi, I'm Lester. And welcome to
back.
Another episode. Shoot, we did. Okay. Let's do this again.
Okay.